we can see Paul coming, and what he's saying in verse 21 to 28 is simply the message that he's been saying all the time. But he is having a little bit of a different approach. He was all the time showing to them and saying to them, listen, you cannot have life by the law. I have been there. It doesn't have power. I know what I'm talking about, and so forth. And here and there, he was quoting Abraham and so forth. But now he's going into a very good explanation of this. And he's saying, I want to show you what the law actually says. Like I said previously, you need to know that the Gentiles didn't have the law. They weren't even allowed to all the time. I mean, they could stand outside of the synagogue and hear the law written or the law read, but the explanation that the people in the synagogue would give of the law was always a message of exclusion. So it would not help these Gentiles to go to the synagogues, to go to the places where they would hear the law. They didn't have any writings. They didn't have the prophets. They didn't have Elijah. They didn't have any of those things. And any place they would go to, the true context of this and what it prophesies unto and what it's actually pointing to is not even preached. So now he goes in Galatians and he says, let me just give you a short message where I take the law and show to you that what I'm saying is true and how you are the blessed. Now let us read Galatians 4 verse 21 to 28. It says, tell me, you that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, the one by the bondmaid and the other by the free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. Which things are an allegory, for those are the 2 covenants, the one from Mount Sinai that genders to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and answers to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, rejoice you barren that bears not. Break forth and cry, you that travail not. For the desolate has many more children than she that has an husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. Now this is a very powerful thing that Paul is saying here. He is basically saying that Abraham had 2 sons, one that was of Hagar and one that was of Sarah. He says that the one that was of Hagar was according to the flesh. Now I believe the reason why he's calling it according to the flesh or the law is amazing here, because the law actually only came 430 years later. But how can he refer to a passage where he's now saying, don't you hear what the law says? And now he goes and he refers to a passage that was long before the giving of the law. Now, that means to me, in the mind of Paul, was one of 2 things. That he basically saw all of the writings, even the writings to Abraham, and the way where it was written, that it was written as law, as something that brings bondage unto you. Or another way of looking at it was that Abraham was under the Chaldean law by that time, and that the Chaldean law did not believe that you could be married to more than one wife, like the Jews believed. They believed that you could only have one wife. And under that law, should you not have a child, and your wife would go childless, that after a certain period of time, I think it was about 10 years, then that law would allow for the wife to say that that she gives her bondservant or her servant, not the bondservant, a servant, as someone who would bear children for her. That means that the lady that worked in the house, that was Hagar at that time, which was a slave or a servant unto Abraham and Sarah, that Sarah was allowed by the law to say unto Abraham, Abraham, you take her now, and she will bear me a child, which will then be a child that was born under the law, or because of the law system that there was. And what the law then also said, if you go and study out that law, it said that you were never allowed to tell that bondwoman to leave the house, because if she would bear you a child, then she and her child, by that law, had to stay in the house forever, and that the child that was born of the flesh or of the law would then be an heir. Now, he comes and he says, listen, let us see what is truly said here. What was said to Abraham, and how does that apply unto us? He says that this bondwoman or the slave woman was then, and the child that came forth from the bondwoman was then born after the flesh, and not the one that God has promised. So he says, that which comes forth from a law or from the flesh, he calls this now born after the flesh, or born after the working or the doing of man, born after man-made plans and ability. It was man that decided, this is what I must do, and he went and brought forth what God has promised. So he says, if you want to bring forth what God has promised according to the law, according to your own works, it is not what God has promised. So the heir and the one who would be one that inherits is not the one that comes from the law, but the one that comes from promise only. And we have established what this promise thing is about in Galatians chapter 3 so clearly. And he says that God is one, and that the only way we can be an heir is of the doing, where God is the Alpha and the Omega of the whole thing, where it is not by the hand of a mediator, where there is a deal or any of those kind of things. And we also see in this passage that it says here that this bondwoman now, Paul comes and says, this bondwoman, the one that is of the law, is now answering to Jerusalem and Sinai, talking about the law of Moses, talking about a law whereby we have fruit. Now, I believe that it was because of that law whereby Sarah also had or whereby Hagar had a child for Sarah. Now, I don't have that as a proof. I've just read up on this, and it was very interesting to know that Sarah couldn't bring forth children, and then the law allowed her to have a child by someone that was a slave. And the beautiful, if we look from there, the whole thing that Paul comes with when he talks about the slave or being in slavery, using the slave language and all of that. So I do believe that the whole language in Galatia does give me a little bit of liberty to go to that passage and says that. But even if you don't want to use it that way, it doesn't matter. I just think this is how Paul got to it. But if he didn't get to it that way, that's fine. He still comes and he says that the bondwoman, Hagar, refers to basically Israel and the whole Jewish system and the law of Moses, which was Sinai. Let us read it. I'm just going to read it again from verse 23 here. He says, but he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman by promise. Flesh here simply meaning works, your own ability, obeying laws. So they obeyed the law, therefore Hagar had a child. It was not of promise, it was of following the laws of that time. He says, which things is an allegory. In other words, this is a type and a shadow, for these are two covenants. The one from Mount Sinai, which genders to bondage, which is Hagar. So he comes and he says, this whole law thing that was given on Mount Sinai, it genders to bondage. The whole thing is, it cannot bring any freedom at all. And this is Hagar. It goes on in verse 25. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and answers. Now this is so, it is so powerful. It says, and it answers to Jerusalem. This answers to Jerusalem. It is saying what Jerusalem is saying now. The whole temple, the Temple Mount, the holy place, everything there. And I also believe that in the back of his mind here, it answers to Jerusalem as in these people that are now coming, sending people to Judaize you. This, what is happening, you answers to what's happening to you, which I think in the back of our mind actually comes from Jerusalem and the influence from Jerusalem. Where else will it come from but from there? Because that's where everything started, and that's where the biggest issue was, as we have seen in Acts 15 and in Acts 21. But the Jerusalem which is above is free, which is the mother of us all. So he's talking about the spiritual Jerusalem, that which the Lord has done, which is above, which is greater than this. That is the Jerusalem of promise, the city, according to the writer of the book of Hebrews, of which God is the builder and not man. So he is saying that this is all talking about the grace of God and the influence of God and how God is coming to give us life. This whole thing about Abraham and Hagar and all of that, so that we will not go to the law system. And now you Gentiles, or you church in Galatia, you now going back to the old system, which could never have given life. It was Hagar. It was not from God. It is not the promise. It was not what God has planned at all. And now it says here in verse 27, for it is written, rejoice you that are barren, that bears not, break forth and cry, you that travail not, for the desolate has many more children as the one, as she that has, which has an husband. So he's actually saying that the Jews were seen as married to God, but now the Gentiles are having much more children. There's so many more people believing there, showing this as the fulfillment. And the scripture also says that clearly that the bondwoman shall not be heir with the free, and that the bondwoman and the child should be cast out. And that is now saying that the old system, which there is, which is by your works and by all those kind of things, that is cast out, and that child will never be an heir with the free. That is what he's also saying. He says to them, listen, I want you to know, you are of the promise. God promised to Abraham and his seed, not as unto many, but as unto one, which is Christ. And you are a believer, and because you are a believer, you are of the free. You're not under the bondage of the law. Therefore, just stay that way. Well, we've come to the end of this passage, and I believe this has blessed you.